Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, it is time to take some of your questions. I had a whole bunch saved up from before my unintended hiatus, and I got some more over Bluesky today as I was before I recorded. So let's start actually with the backlog, and those are all over on Twitter, and we still call it Twitter here. First one is from Sue Louisa, who asks, how can Pierre Poilievre be prime minister if he can't/won't pass a security clearance? So the thing about security clearance is that it is largely need to know. When you are prime minister, you need to know. So that's pretty much automatic. What if you become prime minister? It doesn't require any of the additional steps because, well, you need to know. That does raise some particular questions if you have someone who is potentially compromised, but that is not up to the security services to really deal with. In that situation, Phil Legasse has suggested something like the Governor General would likely need to get involved in that sort of a situation. But that is a whole story for another day. But suffice to say, yes, if you're prime minister, you need to know so you get the clearance. That's pretty much how that works. Ryan St. Jean asks, how many chairs are in the cabinet meeting room and how big is the table? Do less important/junior ministers have to sit against the wall? And says in Ontario, this is more of a problem where they don't have enough space in the cabinet meeting room. I actually couldn't tell you because journalists are not allowed in there. I will say that Trudeau kind of made it a policy that there are no junior ministers. Everyone is essentially equal. That's why we don't have ministers of state anymore. Everyone's a full minister. So I'm assuming that would have something to do with how they get seated around the table. But I couldn't say because not allowed in the room. Dieter McPherson asks, people often see the executive branch in the United States as more powerful than the PMO/cabinet in Canada. Can you explain how some of the ways in which the Canadian system actually grants more authority to the PMO versus the Oval Office? So yes, in many respects, the Prime Minister has more powers than the President of the United States because of the way our Parliament is structured. Because the executive is essentially fused with the legislative branch, they have a lot more power to be able to enable things in terms of, they initiate their own spending bills, they initiate their own foreign policy directions. And if they have a majority, that gets passed really easily. If they don't have a majority, they still nevertheless manage, because they have the confidence of the chamber, manage to get a lot of these things through. In terms of executive orders and or orders in council in Canada, I guess we would say. Again, that all depends on having the confidence of the chamber, and so things essentially get enacted because, the Prime Minister has confidence and therefore he can exercise these powers. That doesn't exactly work the same in the US because executive powers are only limited in certain areas. The rest have to come from the legislature, and oftentimes the party in control of Congress is different from the party of the president, and therefore they are at loggerheads. Not going to be a problem for Trump because he will control all of Congress. However, generally speaking, Canadian or UK Prime Minister generally has more ability to do things and exercise authority because of the way in which the Confidence Convention is structured in our system as opposed to the Americans, who built it deliberately to ensure that there would be the ability, or that the executive would not have too many powers, because they didn't want a king. So that's how some of those differences work. William Smith asks, with all of the resources out there, why do certain groups of people believe Pierre Poilievre doesn't have a current security clearance? It's a requirement for every federal employee. He's not a federal employee. Members of parliament are not employees. They're elected officials. And they only get security clearances if they need to know things. Polyev had requisite clearance when he was a minister because he needed to know things. As opposition leader, he chooses not to know certain things. He has been offered the clearance and the briefings, and we know that he has rejected that offer because he finds it easier to say outlandish things rather than if he was briefed and he would know things, then he can't say as many outlandish things because he would have to be more responsible in what he says. He doesn't want to be. That's what that whole situation is about. Again, it's a need to know thing. For most things, opposition leaders have not needed to know or have chosen not to know. We have a whole thing in Canada about how our opposition parliamentarians have largely decided not to be knowledgeable about such things because they would rather be able to say extraordinary things or make wild accusations in the House of Commons and in the media. Whereas if they knew these things, they would have to be more tempered in their commentary. And for the most part, for most of our history, they have chosen not to. And there are academic studies on this very fact. So again, he could get the clearance if he wanted. He did have it once upon a time when he was a minister. He has chosen not to for his own reasons, and that's what that's about. All right, we're moving over to Bluesky and to the questions that came to me today. First one is from Toondrishan, who asks, unlikely to get very far with this one, but I thought I should try. Given the intersection between climate change, housing, sustainability, economy, industry, R&D, and culture, how come Canada does not have a national architecture policy? My guess would be because a lot of these things, particularly around housing and building codes and so on, are all provincial jurisdiction. Therefore, it has not been seen to have a federal role for them to have a national policy like this. There are suggestions, for example, around building codes where they should have a federal one that provinces can then use as inspiration. But that really hasn't come about because a lot of it is questions about whether that's best use of resources and so on. Yes, it looks like it would be an important thing to have, but because a lot of these things are related to provincial responsibility, nobody's seen fit to do something on a national basis that would be voluntary or what's the word I'm looking for? Not ceremonial, but kind of a nice to have, as opposed to something that's mandatory. So I think that's really the answer. What I would say there. Saeed Khan asks, given your background and insight, what do you believe really was behind the Trudeau/Freeland breakup? It seems unlikely it was simply over budget and GST rebates. I think that was part of it. Freeland, as finance minister, had made certain promises and was trying to live up to certain obligations, and Trudeau and the PMO were frustrating that. So I do think that was part of it. From what we are told, Trudeau had said that he wanted to replace her as minister with Mark Carney without having actually confirmed this with Carney in the first place, trying to bring him into cabinet from outside. And then claimed he was going to give Freeland the most important position, being the Canada-US file, but not attaching her to any department, so she would have no power, no levers of authority, no staff, no budget, purely a ceremonial role, which, you know, that is very easily taken to be something of a demotion. You want to give someone a purely ceremonial position with no power behind it, after someone who's been possibly one of the most powerful ministers in this government. That rankles, that bruises egos, and I can totally see why Freeland made that decision. But I also, we're also hearing a lot of stuff that PMO is just kind of stopped listening to a lot of the stuff that's that people are telling them. And I think that was part of it as well. It's just a frustration that PMO has become Trudeau's PMO has become out of touch with the current moment in Canadian politics. And as a minister, sometimes you can only take so much, and I think that's more or less what happened. But again, not a mind reader. This is just my take from what I can gather from the political landscape. Dominique Joseph asks, any chance of having a next parliament that's more civil and constructive? What potential levels of civility and constructive behavior could we expect depending on who wins the next election? And notes, I'm really, really tired of poisonous politicians who choose to act like lying, bullying, destructive a-holes. Totally understand where you're coming from, but the problem is the incentives right now. And the incentives are to create content for social media, and therefore that leads to the behavior that we are largely seeing in politics, where it's become more toxic, it's become more abrasive, because that gets engagement over social media, and that's what they seem to be gearing their content toward. So they're not even really doing their jobs in the House of Commons anymore. They are using it as a content generation studio, and the kinds of content they are looking for means, in order to boost their engagement, they are behaving in such ways. That is really difficult to overcome. I don't know right now how we're going to, as a society, get past the economy of engagement, I guess I would say, and the behavior that drives. So I don't expect it to be a more civil and constructive parliament the next time, because the incentives just aren't there for it. We'll see if that changes, if more social media platforms start imploding and so on. But as it stands right now, this is what they're gearing, what they're generating toward. And that's really hard to overcome right now. And I think kind of as a society, we need to really start rethinking how we're engaging in these ways, and how we're allowing these algorithms to manipulate our behavior, to act in these ways. That's kind of driving this. Always Vote asks, secession. Fossil fuels are to Alberta what slavery was to South Carolina and the secession states in 1861, right? I don't know. And Danielle Smith is beholden to the fossil fuel companies and or those profiting from them, so must do what they say or go bust, right? Can she aid from Trump succeed Alberta to the USA lawfully / legally? Not really. Separation in Canada is a pretty fraught issue, because that involves essentially changing the Constitution. And there's no real easy way to do that. That's part of what the whole Quebec secession question kind of came down to, was the whole, Clarity Act. What is a clear question to begin the constitutional negotiations that would require that. I don't know that Danielle Smith could get any kind of particular authority to engage in such kind of constitutional negotiations. I think the whole Trump thing is more just rhetoric and tactics. I think he thinks he's being, a tough negotiator by trying to divide us against one another. And Danielle Smith, I don't think, is necessarily wise to what he's doing, and is instead going for a route of appeasement. And so that's where that kind of dynamic is more right now. I don't really see the situation that you're describing here. I think we have challenges, and I think that she has particular incentives that aren't necessarily coming from the fossil fuel industry. I think her incentives are more coming from the particular fanatical wing of her party, which has essentially control of the party, and have not been afraid to, they ousted Jason Kenney, and she is trying to avoid that particular fate, so she appeases to them more. I think it's more about those votes than it is about the actual fossil fuel companies themselves. So I think that's more what that is about. Stephen Dame asks, Turner and Campbell never met Parliament as prime ministers. So Carney wins on the 9th, signed in on the 10th, Parliament resumes on the 24th. If the government is defeated on the throne speech, has he technically met Parliament, or is throne speech considered Governor General thing simply hosted in the Parliament buildings? So Turner sat in the gallery as prime minister without having actually met Parliament. That's I don't think it was for very long, but I mean there are photos of Turner in the gallery, waving down to the MPs while he could not take a seat. So I think that's more what that would actually be. In terms of if they're defeated on the throne speech, I mean if Parliament resumes and if he doesn't call an election before then, Parliament resumes, they get defeated on either the response to the throne speech from the throne, or on the supplementary estimates, which are mandatory votes, which would happen at the end of March regardless. In that particular case, I mean, he has not really met Parliament because he did not have a seat. But Parliament, nevertheless, would have withdrawn confidence, and so the Governor General would have to take that to mean yes, confidence is no longer there, so they would have to dissolve to an election. But yeah, I don't think that necessarily counts as meeting in the same way that John Turner didn't either. And I guess just to add to that, Kim Campbell did have a seat. It was just she became prime minister during the summer, and when the House of Commons wasn't sitting, and the election was in the fall. So that's kind of what happened there, in how she didn't meet, even though she did have a seat in Parliament as well. All right, and our final question is from Karen Markle, who asks, she'd like to stop the rhetoric that Poilievre and the Conservatives are a shoo-in in the next election, because that sort of talk made Doug Ford's win guaranteed in Ontario, and asks, is it possible to change the narrative? Does the average citizen have the tools to resist the message of fait accompli? And then says, Poilievre changed the rules for Elections Canada, preventing them from get out the vote messages. Didn't the Liberals reverse it? So yes, the Liberals did reverse those rule changes. So Elections Canada itself can encourage people to vote, which is what Poilievre, as when he was the Minister of Democratic Reform, or whatever they called it at the time, put a stop to, because he wanted just the parties to do that work and not Elections Canada itself. As for whether it's possible to change the narrative, yes, it's possible, but it's hard right now because we have media outlets that are basically gearing their coverage toward the polls. The polls are telling them that it's going to be a landslide, and therefore that's what they gear the messages toward. I've written columns to the effect that he hasn't won yet. There is nothing inevitable about this. The last two Conservative leaders defeated themselves in the elections, and there is no reason to believe that Poilievre could not make it a third time, because he is such an abrasive character, and people are just as likely to get turned off of him as they see more of him in an election cycle. But again, we can't guarantee this. But I guess I would say, just in order to resist the narrative and the sense of inevitability, just keep yourself informed, have these discussions, remind people that things change in elections, campaigns matter, they absolutely matter. In 2015, the Liberals were in third place and Thomas Mulcair was polling at the top. And people were saying that he was going to win the election. And that really did not happen. So things change. There is nothing inevitable about it, but it requires ordinary people to push back against these kind of narratives. At the same time, don't be delusional. It's a very difficult time right now. I don't think that, it's not going to be an easy fight. But again, nothing is cast in stone. Campaigns matter. Keep this in mind and just remind people. And that's about the most we can do, given the current media environment is one that is so poll driven, and that's what the message they're taking from it is. All right, and that's everything for this week. Thank you all for your questions, and we'll do this again in a few more weeks. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.